Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 3rd. It should have been an easy run. After all, it was just a routine crossing over a warm stretch of the South Pacific. Before dawn on October 3rd, 1955, a small merchant vessel called the Joyita slipped out of Apia, Samoa. Her destination was the Tokelau Islands, about 270 miles to the north. On board were 25 people, 9 passengers, and 16 crew. They were transporting a cargo of medical supplies, timber, food, and dozens of empty fuel drums meant to return filled with copra. The Joyita was a tired old boat, running late and limping along on just one engine, but her captain trusted her. He believed that she was unsinkable. 2 days later, the Joyita failed to arrive. For 6 days, Royal New Zealand Air Force planes scoured the ocean without finding so much as a scrap of debris. Then, more than a month later, another ship finally spotted her, adrift and half-flooded. The Joyita was still afloat, but every passenger and every crew member had vanished. No distress call had ever been received. No bodies were ever found. Today, we're talking about the mysterious disappearance and reappearance of the MV Joyita and the people who were never found. Let's get started. The trip began as a practical mission. Tokelau had run short on supplies, and doctors there needed urgent help with a patient who required surgery. The man tapped to make the run was Captain Thomas Dusty Miller, a British-born mariner who had settled in Samoa. He knew the seas well and had faith in the Joyita. She wasn't pretty. She'd been built as a luxury yacht back in 1931, but then she was converted into a Navy patrol vessel during World War II before being turned into a working cargo ship. She'd been patched and repatched, and her cork-lined hull showed her age. But one thing about her was certain. She was stubbornly buoyant. Miller often bragged that she couldn't sink. On the early morning of October 3rd, Miller finally set out, though the Joyita was running on just one engine, as her port engine had been disabled by a failed clutch. Still, he was confident that she could make the 41 to 48-hour run to Tokelau. The passengers that morning were an eclectic mix. Government official Feifulau Fiali, surgeon Dr. Alfred Andy Parsons, who was traveling to perform that urgent surgery, a copra buyer, a few traders, and 2 children. The cargo included food, medical supplies, and about 80 empty 45-gallon fuel drums. By October 6, when the Joyita had still not arrived, officials in Tokelau radioed for help. The Royal New Zealand Air Force dispatched flying boats for a massive aerial search. Day after day, they swept the sea between Samoa and Tokelau. The search covered nearly 100,000 square miles, and yet the Pacific stayed silent. Searchers didn't find the wreckage of the Joyita. They didn't find rafts or even an oil slick. They found nothing at all. It wasn't until November 10th, 37 days after the Joyita left Samoa, that she was finally found. The cargo ship Tuvalu, traveling between Suva and Funafuti, spotted a vessel far off course, drifting more than 600 miles west of where she was supposed to be, near Vanuatu in Fiji. It was the Joyita. She was heavily listing to port, her deck rail nearly at the waterline. Inside, she was a mess. 4 tons of cargo were gone, and there was no sign of life. When salvagers towed her into Suva days later, journalists crowded the docks. Newspapers quickly gave her a name that stuck: the ghost ship of the Pacific. Inside, the scene was baffling. The ship had clearly taken on water, but she was still floating. The cork lining of her hull and those empty fuel drums kept her buoyant. But alarmingly, most of the navigational equipment had been stripped from the wheelhouse. The radios were missing. And although there was fire damage inside, inspectors determined that it was old and not from this voyage. What she wasn't was sunk. She had floated for weeks, so why had 25 people abandoned a ship that refused to go under? The more they looked, the stranger it seemed. The Joyita's radio had been tuned to 2182 kilohertz, the International Maritime Distress Frequency. Someone had tried to send a mayday, but no one ever received it. Her bilges were flooded, yes, but the hull was still sound. Captain Miller had been right. She was almost impossible to sink. Which begged the question, why leave her at all? Had something scared the crew into lifeboats? Had they believed help was on the way? Investigators in Suva couldn't make the facts fit into a story that actually made any sense. In early 1956, a formal inquiry was convened in Samoa. Its conclusion has haunted the record ever since. The fate of the crew and passengers was, quote, inexplicable on the evidence submitted, end quote. The official investigation couldn't say more than that. Without clarity, theories, of course, came quickly. Newspapers speculated about collisions with other ships. Locals talked about pirates. Some writers, decades later, even hinted at Cold War espionage. But there was no evidence of any of it. The most convincing explanation came years later from New Zealand academic David Wright. His theory was that a corroded pipe in the cooling system failed, flooding the engine room. With only one working engine and broken bilge pumps, the ship became difficult to control, especially at night. Wright argued that the crew probably believed their distress call had gone through. Expecting rescue, someone ordered the passengers into rafts. If true, it was a tragic miscalculation. Because the Joyita, even though it was half sunk, it refused to go down, and the people who had been on it likely would have survived. The Joyita herself lived on for a while, patched yet again, and returned to work in Fiji before finally grounding near Levuka in 1959 and being abandoned. But for the families of those who were on the ship in 1955, the silence stretched on much longer than the headlines. In 2012, more than half a century after the disappearance, Palauan community leader Luther Toloa stood in New Zealand's parliament during a memorial. He urged authorities to open a coronial process, reminding everyone that most of the missing, many of whom were New Zealand citizens, had never been legally declared dead, saying, quote, all the families deserve that, end quote. Without it, there just could be no real closure. In the end, the Joyita's afterlife split in two. The physical hull was left to decay in Levuka's shallows. But the story, the mystery of why 25 people stepped off a ship that refused to sink, still surfaces in memorials and every new attempt to piece the evidence together. The ship came home. The people did not. And the communities that sent them out still mourn their loss. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!